freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, where we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I'm your host, Nico Perino, and today we have a very special So to Speak extra for you, the first of its kind. We're going to continue our conversation about the Turkish government's crackdown on civil society and its persecution and prosecution of journalists, academics, government workers, and more that has come in the aftermath of that failed July 2016 government coup attempt against the Recep Tayyip Erdogan government. If you didn't listen to our first Turkey episode with journalist Mahir Zanalov, I recommend going back and listening to that podcast first. It'll provide some context and color for my conversation today with Middle East Studies Association President Beth Barron. Her organization, MESA, has been sounding the alarm bells about the threat to academic freedom posed by the Turkish government for quite some time now. They've been on a letter-writing spree, to say the least, and in August 2016 sent a letter to Secretary of State John Kerry regarding measures taken against Turkish universities and academics. I spoke with Professor Barron at her offices at the CUNY Graduate Center on Monday, January 9th. We spoke in New York City. And what follows is a conversation with her about the death of liberalism, or the potential death of liberalism and Turkey, and what her organization is doing to help scholars trapped in the middle of it. So here's our conversation with Professor Beth Barron. Professor Beth Barron, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about MESA.
MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, is an organization which just celebrated its 50th anniversary, which is a collection of scholars from around the world whose work focuses on the Middle East. It's an interdisciplinary organization, so we have historians, political scientists, sociologists, people in literature, and so on.
And what are some of the main things that your organization does? I am looking here, of course, this conversation is going to be about Turkey and Erdogan and the threat to academic freedom that exists there. And 3 times, I believe my counting is correct, in the past year, your organization has sort of sounded the alarm bell about what's happening in Turkey. Once on August 19th, and I think that's the most recent time, you sent a letter to Secretary of State John Kerry. Earlier in January, you sent a letter to, I believe, a government institution in Turkey about a recent crackdown on academics who signed a peace petition of some sort, and then you also put out a call to action. So is this typical for your organization?
Okay, so our organization hosts an annual meeting, which is generally in November of a year. But in addition to hosting the annual meeting, in which we have panels and papers and so on a range of issues, we also have a number of committees that carry on with the work, and we have a board as well. The board issued the warning in the letter to John Kerry and so on that you've just mentioned, which was calling attention to issues pertaining to academics in Turkey. The board has issued similar sorts of calls or other calls around dangers for academics or risk to academics going to Egypt and so on in the wake of the killing of a young graduate student there. But we also have in one of our most important committees is a committee on academic freedom. And the Committee on Academic Freedom has 2 branches. One branch is a branch that focuses on North America, and this is headed by Zach Lockman at NYU. And the second branch is a branch that focuses on the Middle East and North Africa, and that branch is headed by Miriam Lowy. And the overall chair of both branches is Laurie Brand, and she's at USC. So the Committee on Academic Freedom generally in the past has issued, perhaps up to half dozen to a dozen letters a year. It's kept its eye on infringements on academic freedom internationally or nationally. But in the past year, the committee issued 15 letters on Turkey alone.
Well, there was a coup in Turkey
all hell is breaking loose in Turkey right now. Explosions and...
Today, Turkey's president declared a 3-month state of emergency.
Where there was an attempt to overthrow the Erdogan government. It failed spectacularly.
Chants of Allah is great in Istanbul's Taksim Square. Supporters of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan gathered to celebrate the failed coup.
And after that, he clamped down on a lot of perceived or alleged dissidents, using some very vague laws, states of emergency, and caught up in this clampdown after the coup were academics,
including school teachers, demanded resignations from over 1,500 university deans and suspended around 8,000 police officers, along with nearly 3,000 judges and prosecutors.
So the Committee on Academic Freedom had a long history of letters on Turkey, but had started its work on Turkey. We noticed a real uptick from January of 2015. And this was in response to the peace petition.
Over a petition criticizing a military crackdown on Kurdish activists.
That was signed by over 1,000 academics, basically saying, not in our name. Not in our name. These academics from Turkey came forward, most of whom were based in Turkey, some of whom were based outside, came forward and signed a petition which was basically calling attention to government actions in the southeast part of the country in the Kurdish region. And calling attention to the infringements of the human rights of people in the region, the crackdown on the curfews, the bombings, and the crackdown on the rights of citizens in that region. So the Committee on Academic Freedom of the Middle East Studies Association had, from the time of that petition and the government crackdown on the signatories of the petition, had been writing letters. In January alone, we had 4 letters that were issued in which the committee began to trace travel bans on people. We had one student who was from, I believe he was based at University of Michigan. He had been in Turkey carrying out research, and he was not allowed to return to the United States. So we wrote 2 letters on his behalf.
And this is separate from the petition signatories, or is this in conjunction with it?
This was separate, but what the committee was also doing was tracking the growing harassment and infringement of the rights of those signatories.
And I'm looking at some of my notes here, and it said that there were about 1,100 Turkish academics, as well as some academics here in the United States, like Noam Chomsky, who had signed that petition. And in response to the signatures, federal prosecutors opened investigations into all 1,128 scholars, if I'm not mistaken. And President Erdogan even went so far in a January 12th speech to say, I call upon all of our institutions, everyone who benefits from the state but is now an enemy of the state, they must be punished without further delay. So, and then as a result, some of these academics were detained, fired, or lose their position within their institution, their academic institutions.
Yes, so this was something that was of great concern to the organization and to the committee, that this pattern of harassment, intimidation, prosecution, repression of scholars. There was one couple in particular that we had worked with scholars at risk to find an institution in the United States to take them in and give them a kind of safe haven here.
Yeah.
Because there was indeed real risk to these scholars who had signed the petitions.
And your organization is a global organization, correct? So something like 3,000 scholars. Do you get letters from these people regularly who are in Turkey and just kind of fear for their livelihoods?
The Committee on Academic Freedom gets letters from individuals and then works with different individuals. But the real thing, the pattern that we've noted over the past year is that this has escalated from not just tracking the fates of individuals, but there have been such collective action, and the numbers have become, the numbers of those impacted has really, we're not talking single-digit numbers of scholars which is oftentimes the way our committee had operated in the past, intervening for individual scholars. I mean, we have continued to intervene in specific cases, and I can talk later about the case of Ishtar Oyedin. But the what has happened is just the numbers of scholars in the past year who have been who have lost their livelihoods and so on. And it's basically what one can call a kind of social death, that they've lost their livelihoods. They're no longer able to practice the profession. We do get letters from individuals and work with them to bring the cases, individual cases or collective cases, to light.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be honest here, Professor Byrne. I mean, I did research. I knew that this was an issue because I follow free speech circles on Twitter, and they're sounding the alarm bell about what's happening in Turkey. But then I read your letter, your organization's letter from August 19th, 2016. I mean, this is, 5 or so months ago. And by the time of your letter, since the coup, the Ministry of Education dismissed over 27,000 employees. The Turkish Higher Education Council announced on Friday, August 12th, that 5,300 academic faculty and staff across the country were suspended or under investigation. The figure included 4,200 faculty members and 1,100 administrative staff. And then in addition, all 1,500 deans at universities across the country were forced to resign. And in many cases, there's been travel bans imposed on some of these academics. So even when you talk about situations like trying to find a home for these people here in the United States at institutions, in some cases it seems to me that they can't even leave.
That's exactly right. That in many cases people cannot leave the country. One important thing to note is that oftentimes I think there's this sort of sense that a lot of these clampdowns and firings and so on came after the coup, and therefore the coup legitimizes these actions. And there has been a sort of sense that the international community needs to be sensitive to Turkey's position and to Erdogan's position in light of a coup. Yet on the other hand, what we've noted with the scholars in Turkey is that this didn't begin with the coup, that there was a lead up to it, starting prior to these signatories, but really in escalations with the signing of the peace petition, that there was a concerted effort to move on certain, clamp down on the universities and clamp down on free speech within universities and clamp down on the ability of scholars to go on such social media as Facebook and Twitter and so on and use these media. I mean, some of our letters prior to the coup note this. Mm-hmm. It's that in the wake of the coup becomes an excuse to really move against and without using freedom of certain procedural law and so on, to move against scholars.
Yeah, when you Google scholars at risk in Turkey or whatnot, one of the first articles that comes up is an article, an op-ed by Merve Kayeki, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, entitled "My Father, Academic, Arrested in Turkey Purge." And she talks about how her father was rounded up, interrogated for 10 days without access to a lawyer or to his family. The government made use of draconian state of emergency rules, such as suspects could be detained for up to 30 days without any charges. The Constitution in Turkey and the European Convention on Human Rights were suspended for 3 months. And the law is what the governor of each province in Turkey decides. Her father was rounded up with, I think it was something like 24 or 27 of his colleagues. And she said that the European Union has come out and said that the lists of those who were purged after the coup seems to be strangely well planned, almost as if these were people who were on lists before the coup. Have you gotten any indication of that? Or do you suspect that might be the case?
What had happened is that there were the list of the scholars who had signed the peace petitions and so on, and so that there was the state was moving in the direction of intimidating, prosecuting, harassing, and so on these scholars. The coup seemed to give license to the state to accelerate the crackdown on these scholars, many of whom had absolutely no connection with the Gulen movement, which has.
And can you explain what that is for us? Are you familiar with it?
With the Gulen movement it's a movement, religious movement that at one point had actually supported the Erdogan regime, and its leader, who's based in Pennsylvania, had been an ally. They've split, and there has been the accusation that the Gulen movement is a state within a state. So essentially, in the wake of the coup, there's been this effort to go after the state within a state.
They're scapegoating the Gulen movement.
Well, no, I won't say scapegoating because there may or may not be evidence that the Gulen movement was behind the coup. I mean, that the state needs to bring evidence and so forth about the role of the movement in behind the coup or not.
And that's something that is really hard to do when all of your trials are behind closed doors, essentially.
Yeah, but the issue with the scholars and the scholars is that many of these scholars who've been kind of rounded up or who've been dismissed and so on have no links to the Gulen movement. Mm-hmm. There are certain universities that may have gotten funding and so on. Just being an employee of that university doesn't necessarily mean that one is part of the movement. It just means that one works for this private university. Or if people got loans from a bank that perhaps was connected to that movement, doesn't necessarily mean that they're a member of the movement at all. So it's, it's sort of like saying, I'm a member of the Chase movement because I keep my money at Chase.
It sounds eerily familiar to something we had here in the United States in the middle of the 20th century with the McCarthyite movement, to try and peg scholars who perceived to have communist sympathies to the Soviet Union, for example, and bringing them before government boards.
The active communists on the fingers of both your hands.
And in many cases, forcing them out of their jobs.
But this is actually different to the extent that many of these scholars don't even necessarily have any sympathy at all with the Gulen movement.
So the connection is even more tenuous.
Oh, it's completely tenuous because oftentimes these are secular scholars who are not members of a religious movement and would not be in sympathy with the Gulen movement. Mm-hmm. So that there is no connection. In essence, what seems to be happening is that the state is simply using the coup as an excuse to crush all the opposition, to crush dissidents, to crush journalists, and to crush scholars in dissent.
Yeah, this woman who wrote the article for the Huffington Post said that initially 3 of the 4 judges overseeing the cases of these academics ruled that the academics should be released because there was no substantial evidence to put them behind bars. And then in a single day, all 3 judges were dismissed and loyalist ones were appointed. The judges, of course, after that, ruled that the academics should go to prison. It seems like the fix is in for many of these academics from the get-go. And if you are one of these scholars, for example, who signs that petition in support of the Kurds in the South, or you have any sympathies that isn't total loyalty to the Erdogan government, and you get rounded up and interrogated, it's almost as if you have no recourse. And she talks about the lawyer for her father who said that the prospect is bleak for his outcome, and to not raise her hopes that anything positive will come from the process. So that's scary. Do you have any specific stories of people that work within MESA or are connected to MESA, things that they've gone through in Turkey?
What I would say for the scholars who've been working with MESA now and who are based in the U.S., that at this point, many are hesitant to speak out, to write, and to be highly visible or associated with anti-government activity because they have family back in Turkey.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, so they have family back in Turkey. They would like to, though some can still travel back and forth, but they would like to do so and be able to have freedom of movement and not put their families at risk. Some know quite clearly that they, for the moment, cannot go back. That it is a risk for them, and that they would definitely be caught up in a sweep of academics.
Yeah. And what about for just American or international scholars that study Turkey? I mean, this is part of the world that has such a rich history. I mean, are scholars not going there to study any of that history anymore? I mean, is there sort of a sensitivity to what's happening there, or fearfulness of what's happening is there, that even if they, like you say, many of these scholars have no connection to the Gulen movement or to any movement that's in the opposition to Erdogan? I mean, you never know. It's the administration there is so erratic.
I mean, there have been a couple of foreign scholars who have been caught up in sweeps. One was asked to leave. I think we mentioned him in one of our letters. What I would say in a certain sense is, people will continue to do, non-Turkish scholars will continue to do their research, will continue to want to go to Turkey to consult archives and so on. Yeah. And we'll do so, I think, also with the intention of letting Turkish scholars know that they're not alone, that they're not isolated. And this is an important point, that Turkish scholars do listen to podcasts. They do read our letters. They do. They need to know that we're very concerned, that we are following what's happening, that we will do what we can do to help, and we're eager to hear their ideas too of what we can do to help them.
Yeah.
But letting them know that they're not alone by continuing to go and do research is an important part of what we can do.
Yeah. And was there any, I know it was probably a long shot, but was there any response from John Kerry to the letter you sent to him, or was it a galvanizing force for those who work and study in the Middle East?
One of the earliest letters that we posted to the Turkish government got a large number of signatories.
I saw that.
Yeah. By other organizations. That there was just a real sense that we needed to do something in a number of organizations. I forget what the last count was.
Well, I'm looking at it here, and it's the College Art Association, the German Studies Association, Modern Language Association, Political Studies Association. I mean, these are big associations and wide-ranging cross-disciplinary associations. So it seems like there's a general concern for what's happening there.
Oh, definitely. We've been asked for information from, I think at one point the European Union wanted follow-up information, which we provided. We haven't heard back from the Turkish government itself, but there is a sense that when international attention is brought to bear on some of these cases, that it does lead to action. And that silence is not the option for the international community. It's not an option at all at this point. I mean, speaking out, drawing attention to the infringements on human rights, on freedom of speech, and so forth is what we need to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, some of these numbers that we talked about earlier, I mean, are just so overwhelming that I think it's hard for people to wrap their minds around what's happening there. It's as if the whole city of New York, the civil servants within New York, and all the academics were rounded up and imprisoned, interrogated, or lose their jobs and then subsequently blacklisted from any other public service jobs, as some reports have indicated. And the New York Times, you were talking about just how careful scholars have to be with doing research or reporting on what's happening in Turkey in some cases because they have family over there. The New York Times, I think, according to one report, announced this past weekend that they're no longer printing bylines from the reporters in Turkey just because of the fear that's happening with the crackdown on journalists there. I mean, for those of us, almost everyone who I'm sure listens to this podcast cares about the principles of academic freedom generally. I mean, what is there that we can do to help?
Well, as we've said, speaking out, drawing attention. One of the initiatives that the Middle East Studies Association is launching now is to raise funds so we continue our work with scholars at risk, but to kind of ramp it up because of the numbers that we're dealing with now. Whether these are scholars from Turkey or Syria or elsewhere in the region, the numbers are just staggering at this point in time. So we're beginning. We will be beginning a real fundraising effort so that we can increase the numbers of those that we can give safe haven to. And these are people who would have lost their jobs and have no options, but also have the option to leave the country. That's one thing that we'll be working on. And I think that will be a really important kind of concrete initiative.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me about this situation is that Turkey, if you were to ask me about it 5 years ago, I would have said, yeah, they're on the fast track to the European Union. They're this quote unquote liberal democracy. And if you would ask me where the greatest threats in the world are to academic freedom and to liberal democracy, I would have said places like China or Russia or North Korea, obviously, but never Turkey. How should we think about it as a state today?
I mean, I think there were warnings. I mean, those who look back, and this is looking back, half a dozen years, would have noted the aggrandizement of power at the center of the Turkish state, and the path that Erdogan and his party were on. But there was a tremendous acceleration of this centralization of power, this accumulation of power within the past year. I mean, it really accelerated in a completely unprecedented way. It's an authoritarian state. It's not the only state in the world that's moving in this direction and has become more authoritarian. But it's just it happened at such an alarming rate in a region that in which intellectual and cultural life seem to find full expression and full freedom. And so the reversal is really dispiriting on so many levels.
I mean, prior to this year, what were some of the countries, if you're familiar with this, that your Committee on Academic Freedom were most concerned about outside of Turkey?
The committee had tracked infringements on academic freedom in some of the Gulf states, particularly in the clampdown after the so-called Arab Spring, and the clampdown on in the region in places like Bahrain and elsewhere, and also actually Egypt has been a country where there's been attention, particularly the past few years. In the past, prior to that, I mean, the committee had always been concerned with infringements of Palestinians' rights, and track that, had often been accused of paying too much attention to that in a certain sense, and in the broader context, in a comparative context, but had been deeply concerned with infringements of rights there. And in Iran, there was a track record of infringements on academic freedom.
Yeah, I remember this was a couple of years ago when it first came out. I was really struck by the book, and I forget the name of the author, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which was just about sort of the cloistered environment in which women could get together and have a reading circle of books like, Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita and other Western classics and sometimes Middle Eastern classics, as we forget. A lot of us who don't work in this world every day, that there was a very rich history in the Middle East, and it was for a very long time in the 20th century pretty liberal in this respect.
We had a case this past year of a scholar who was a MESA member, who had been imprisoned in Iran and for a number of months, and she was eventually released on health grounds. She attended the MESA meeting, and she
is this the MESA meeting this November?
This past
great.
This past November, which was so gratifying for the membership and for the committee and for all of us to see her there. But it was also quite frightening to hear what imprisonment to scholars means. I mean, basically,
it's just such a foreign concept to hear us here in the United States.
Yeah, she was in solitary for some time, and she was essentially interrogated in lengthy sessions for her scholarship on feminism and really? Gender and so on.
Yeah, I mean, we at FIRE, we work with scholars all the time who do research that ruffles feathers, and then they're brought in front of their administrations, or they're told politely in some cases to just maybe find a different area to focus on. but never have we dealt with a case where one of our scholars to whose defense we come is put in solitary confinement by the government. It's just an incredible fact to sort of digest in my mind. And hopefully there's never a time in America where we do have to worry about it. But I do think, and I do hope that the listeners to this show will think about what it means for our colleagues and friends overseas. At your November meeting, was this a hot topic? I mean, your organization does a lot of things. Was academic freedom at the forefront?
It definitely was one of the major issues on the agenda. I mean, with Huma Hudfar attended the meeting, and we all, were able to recognize that she was there. We had started with the intention of having a special session on 5 years after the Arab Spring. By the time the meeting actually rolled around, we had added on a special section on infringements on academic freedom in Turkey and Egypt, and then added another special section on the impact of the Turkish coup on general human rights within Turkey and so on. So that the academic freedom issue is very much at the center of our concerns. It's not only our colleagues who come to our meetings and so on, but our colleagues are producing scholarship throughout the MENA region.
Well, great. I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to ask you, as I do all of my guests, if there's anything you're working on right now, either within your organization or in your personal scholarship, that listeners who might want to learn more about you and your organization, that they can check out.
I had completed a book, The Orphan Scandal, Christian Missionaries and the Rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, came out 2 years ago, and that's a work that focuses on the connection between the earlier international interventions in the Middle East, including American missionary interventions, and their connections to the rise of Islamic movements. So that was a past work. I'm turning to new sorts of scholarship. But for the present time, as president of the Middle East Studies Association, my sort of thoughts and energies are focused on helping our colleagues around the world to bring attention to their situations and to hope for a safer and better future for all of us.
And we can, for some of our listeners interested, they can read some of these letters that you've written about Turkey or your organization has at, I believe it's mesana.org, MESANA.org.
Yeah. The letters are under the Committee on Academic Freedom. Our most recent letter looks at the situation of Ishtar Goizedin and her situation. She's a professor of someone who got a degree at Georgetown University International Law School, graduated from NYU Law School, and has a PhD in law from Istanbul University. Full credentials. She's one of the latest scholars whose story we wanted to bring attention to. She's currently under arrest in Izmir. As one of the scholars from Gediz University who was fired and then has come under arrest. She's a human rights activist, and we really hope that she's released and can continue her work, her very important work.
Yeah, well, I hope some of our listeners will go to your website, your organization's website, to learn more about her story, and to the extent they can help out in spreading the word about what's happening in Turkey. Professor Barron, thank you for joining us today, and best of luck.
Thank you very much.
That was Middle East Studies Association President Beth Barron. To learn more about MESA and to read its letters, including its letters from the Committee on Academic Freedom to Turkey, visit mesana.org. That is MESANA.org. I hope you've enjoyed these last two episodes on Turkey. I hope they've been enlightening. If you are as appalled by what's been happening in the country as I am, please help spread the word by sharing these podcasts. It's important that we let the Erdogan government know that the eyes of the world are upon it. Also, consider supporting MESA and following the work of Mahir Zanalov, our previous guest, a journalist, on Twitter. This podcast is hosted, recorded, and produced by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So To Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/SoToSpeakPodcast. You can also email us feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org, or call in a question for a future show at 215-315-0100. Again, that's 215-315-0100. Until next time, thanks everyone for listening.